With your imagination, you can travel to enchanted places near and far, to a land with high snowy mountains and magical ravens. You can journey to a foreign city across the wide blue ocean for a chance to spend an afternoon talking with small children about their life and dreams. Rafe Martin, an award-winning storyteller and author, retells an Algonquin Cinderella story, The Rough-Faced Girl. The performance of this story was the basis for Rafe's critically acclaimed book, The Rough-Faced Girl, beautifully illustrated by David Shannon, published by G.P. Putnam Sons, 1992.
If you went up to the shores of Lake Ontario 3 or 4 or 500 or even 1,000 years ago, you would have seen an ordinary sight. A village down by the lakeshore, smoke curling up from the cooking fires, dogs barking, children playing, hunters coming out of the woods with deer slung over their shoulders. It was an ordinary village in every way, except for one thing. Off from the other wigwams, maybe a quarter or a half a mile, was a great, big, huge wigwam, and painted on its sides were pictures of the sun, moon, stars, plants, trees, and animals. And inside this wigwam was said to live a very great, rich, powerful, and supposedly handsome, invisible being. Only no one could see him, except his sister, who lived there too. Now all the girls in this village wanted to marry this invisible being. They'd come down to his wigwam, and there would be his sister waiting. "Ah," she'd say, "why have you come?" "Oh, we want to marry the invisible being." "If you want to marry my brother, the invisible being, you have to have seen him. Tell me, have you seen my brother, the invisible being?" "Oh, of course we've seen him," they'd say. "Oh, sure, definitely, yes, yeah." "All right," she'd say. "If you think you've seen my brother, the invisible being, then just, tell me, what's his bowstring made of?" And her voice was swift as lightning and loud as the thunder. His bowstring," they'd say, his bowstring, we know it's the rawhide strip." "No," she'd say, "no. If you think you've seen my brother, the invisible being, then just, tell me, what's the runner of his sled?" "The runner of his sled," they say, "the runner of his sled, we know it's the green willow branch. That's it, the green willow branch." "No," she'd say, "no. You have not seen my brother. Go home." Oh, give us one more chance," they'd ask. Just test us fair. We've seen him. We wouldn't lie about something as important as this. No, not us. Just don't ask us these silly questions. Test us fair." "All right," she'd say. "Come with me." And she'd take them back to that great wigwam and seat them in the seats furthest from the entrance, which are, as you know, the guest seats. Then they'd hear footsteps coming along the path, closer, closer. The flap of the door, just made of buckskin, lifted up, and in stepped something, but you couldn't see it. You could only hear it breathing. The cushions by the door flattened down as if something was seated on them. A great bow and a beaded quiver of arrows appeared, was placed in the corner. 2 moccasins appeared, were hung on the straps. And though those girls sat there all night, they never saw a thing more. And in the morning, they had to go home, ashamed. Now this went on for a long time, but in the end, one girl married the invisible being. And this is how it happened. In this village there lived a poor man who had 3 daughters. The 2 older daughters were cruel and hard-hearted, and they made their youngest sister sit by the fire and always feed the flames, because she sat so close to the fire. When the burning branches popped, shooting up a burst of sparks, why, those sparks fell on no one but her, and in time her hands became burnt and scarred, her arms became burnt and scarred, her face became burnt and scarred, and her beautiful black hair was all burnt too. And those two older sisters, they laughed at her and said, "Ha! You're ugly, you rough-faced girl." And they named her the rough-faced girl, and they made her life very sad and very lonely and very miserable indeed. Now one day these two older sisters went to their father and said, "Father, give us some pretty new necklaces. Give us some new buckskin dresses. Give us some pretty beaded moccasins. We are going to marry the invisible being." Now their father was a poor man, but somehow he got these things together for them. And dressed in their finest clothes, these two girls began to walk through the village, and all the people came out of their wigwams. They pointed and stared and said, "Look! Look at those beautiful girls. Look at their beautiful clothes. Surely one of them is going to marry the invisible being." And if those two girls were proud and hard-hearted before, why, when they heard that, they became even more proud and hard-hearted now, and very haughtily they walked through the village. At last they came to the wigwam of the invisible being, and there was his sister waiting. "Why have you come?" she asked. "Oh, we want to marry the invisible being. That's why we're here." If you want to marry my brother, the invisible being, you have to have seen him. Tell me, have you seen my brother, the invisible being? "Oh, of course we've seen him," they said. "Sure, can't you see how pretty we are? Look at our beautiful clothes. Anybody could tell we're the ones who've seen the invisible being." "All right," she said. "So you think you've seen my brother, the invisible being? Well, if you have, just tell me. What's his bowstring made of?" And her voice moved like the lightning striking, became strong as the thunder. "His bowstring," they said. His bowstring, we know. And turning desperately to one another, they whispered, "What shall we say? What shall we say?" And the oldest said, "Oh, it must be the rawhide strip." So they said, "Oh, we know, it's the rawhide strip." And she said, No. She saw at once how they lied. "Tell me," she said, "if you claim to have seen my brother, the invisible being, then just tell me, what's the runner of his sled?" "Oh, we know, cried the two sisters, and then they whispered to one another, saying, "What shall we say? What shall we say?" And the youngest said, "Oh, it must be the green willow branch." So they turned again and said, "We know, no problem. Green willow branch. That's it, green willow branch." And the sister of the invisible being said, "No, you have not seen my brother. Go home." And they went home, ashamed. Now the next day the rough-faced girl went to her father and said, "Father, may I please have some pretty beads for a necklace? May I please have a new buckskin dress and some pretty beaded moccasins? I am going to marry the invisible being." But her father said, "Daughter, I am sorry. I have no beads left for you, only a handful of little broken shells. I have no buckskin dress for you, and as for moccasins, all I have left now are my own old, worn, cracked, and stretched out pair from last year, and they're much too big." But she said, "Whatever you can spare, I can use." So he gave her these things. She went into the forests, and she stripped birch bark from the dead trees, and with birch bark she made a cap, a dress, and leggings all of bark, and with a sharp piece of bone she carved in the bark pictures of the sun, moon, stars, plants, trees, and animals. She found dried reeds, and she strung those little broken shells on the dried reeds and made her own necklace. She went down to the lake shore and soaked the moccasins in the water until they grew soft, and then she molded them to her feet. But they were still too big, and when she walked they just flapped, flapped, flapped like duck's feet, and it sounded funny. Then all the people came out of their wigwams. They pointed, they looked, they laughed, they said, "Ha! Look at that ugly girl! Look at her funny clothes! Look at those silly moccasins that flap, flap, flap like duck's feet! Hey, 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 go home, you ugly girl! You'll never marry the invisible being!" But the rough-faced girl had faith in herself, and she had courage, and she didn't turn back. She just walked right through the village, though they pointed and they laughed. And at last, just as the sun was sinking behind the hills, and the stars were glittering out in the night sky one by one overhead, she came at last to the lake shore and to the wigwam of the invisible being. And there stood the sister of the invisible being, waiting. Now, let me tell you something about the sister of the invisible being. She was a wise woman. When she looked at you, she didn't just see your skin or your face or your hair or your clothes. No. When she looked at you, she could look you right in the eyes and see all the way down to your heart. And she could tell if you had a good, kind heart or a cold, hard, and cruel one. And as she looked at the rough-faced girl, she could see that, scarred as her skin, burnt as her hair, strange as her clothes, she had a beautiful, kind heart. And so she welcomed her dearly, saying, "Welcome. Why have you come?" And the rough-faced girl said, "I want to marry the invisible being." "Ah," said the sister, "if you want to marry him, you have to have seen him. Tell me, have you seen my brother, the invisible being?" And the rough-faced girl said, "Yes." "All right then," said the sister. "If you've seen him, just tell me, what's his bowstring made of?" And the rough-faced girl, whom everyone had laughed at, said, "His bowstring. His bowstring, it's the rainbow." "Ah!" exclaimed the sister. "Ah, if you've seen him, just tell me, what's the runner of his sled?" And the rough-faced girl, whom everyone had laughed at, said, "The runner of his sled, it's the Spirit's Road, the Milky Way of stars that spread overhead." "Ah," said the sister, "you have seen him. Come with me." And she took her back to the wigwam, and she sat her in the seats right next to the entrance, which is the wife's seat. Then they heard footsteps coming along the path, closer and closer. The flap of the door lifted up, and in stepped the invisible being, terrible in his power, but oh, so beautiful. And when he saw her sitting there, he turned to his sister and said, "We're found out at last, and she is beautiful." And the sister said, "Yes." Then the sister of the invisible being got a beautiful necklace of perfect shells and a beautiful embroidered buckskin dress. She gave these things to the rough-faced girl and said, "Go down to the lake and bathe, and then put these on." So the rough-faced girl went down to the lake, and she bathed in the water. And when she bathed in the water, what was this? All the scars left her body. Her skin became smooth again, and her hair grew in long and glossy as a raven's wing, and anyone could see now that she was beautiful. But the invisible being and his sister had seen that from the start. Wearing those fine clothes, she went back to the wigwam. Then the rough-faced girl and the invisible being were married. They lived together in great gladness and were never parted.
One of the storyteller's greatest gifts, Rafe Martin believes, is an imagination open to all living things. Because of this, he tells tales from traditional cultures around the world, as well as a growing number of his own stories. He talks about the rough-faced girl with Bob Coke.
Rafe, you have experience of a lot of live storytelling. That is,
Yeah.
you're live and the audience is right there in front of you. And of course, over the radio as well, where again we're live, but it's different. There you don't have the visual.
Yeah.
What kind of a difference is it for you? I mean, what do you need to do that?
Well, it's interesting, Bob. Where I made, I think, the most sense of discovery for myself of how that works was actually in studio when I recorded my work on tape. The big difference is, of course, when you're telling a story, you'd be amazed how much of the story is not in words. It's in your body language. It's in your eye contact with the audience. It's in your expression. It's in the silences. Much of the story exists in silence. But, of course, when you're on radio or recording in studio on tape, the only place the story is in the words. So, what you used to do in telling a story, let's say by raising an eyebrow or by giving a look to the audience, or that's gone. If it's not literally there in the language, in your breath, in your pausing, in anything you're doing with words and breath, let's say, it doesn't exist, which means you really have to change the way you tell the story. And what I've discovered is that each technology essentially brings out a different version of the story. A different vision really underlies each technology's approach to the tale, so that the same story that I tell live would be maybe even different words in many ways, in many places, in a recorded telling, and completely different again in a book with, let's say, a picture book, and completely different again in a book without pictures, and different again when I record it, let's say, on videotape, which is a different media, has a different sense of intimacy than being in a large audience, and you have to tell the story in a different way.
In the series we've had here, Out into the Garden, you get some musical underlining too.
Yeah.
I suppose that can do part of the job as well.
Well, it's interesting, and I agree with you. I think that when you're recording work, you really begin to need to think about music and some degree of sound effect and things like that, because you're approaching the imagination from a different realm. And it's an acoustic imagination. And that means that things that you would have been doing with body, with gesture, or in a picture book, things you would be doing with image, now body has to be replaced by sound in one way or another. And music, of course, goes directly to imagination, to the heart. And I think it makes a very meaningful connection. And that's not something I would ever think of doing, really, in live performance.
I was thinking of the music of the language itself in this very ancient art.
Yes.
Whoever
Yes.
was Homer or were Homer,
Right. Yes.
and the epithets, the wonderful phrases that would come through there in that great oral tradition.
Yeah.
Do you find that you store up those kinds of things? I mean, that you have these epithets ready, or as opposed to, say, sheer memorization of the whole text?
I don't memorize at all.
Right.
But
I suspected you didn't.
Yeah.
That's why I was wondering.
What I see storytelling today is much closer, let's say, as a working model to jazz, which is that you see it in your mind, essentially, and once you've seen it, you will be able to tell it. But it may mean that in each telling, new things may appear, and in that, it's in performance that the story really grows. I don't sit home and practice it. It's once I've kind of grasped the essence of the story for myself, and I can see it like I'm there, then it's only in the act of performance that the story really begins to come alive. And that's what jazz is. It's like putting yourself in that boundary realm with audience and live performance, not practicing, but where it has to happen. And I find jazz to be the most exciting model, I think, for giving me a sense of what's happening in storytelling. Of course, in the older bardic traditions, there were schools where they were trained to hold the epithets, hold the patterns in their minds. And because we don't have that kind of oral tradition as almost a school and a system today, I think we've had to look in different directions. Also because most storytellers today are literate. people recreating an oral tradition. We're not truly oral people, which means a lot of our things are based from text, which means we really have to relearn how to hear language. And that, of course, is one of the great gifts of being, of hearing a storyteller, of being involved with storytelling, is that your connection with language is renewed. And language, of course, is the great gift of all past generations to us. It's through language, through sounds on the air, words, or squiggles on paper, words, that we get to see our own images. And no other technology we have gives us that.
The power of the words is enhanced with sound effects and the variety of instruments chosen to play the special music that has been composed as background for the story. The musicians and composers, Dennis, Nicholas, and Mary Catherine Monroe, create a fabric of sound to reflect the mystery and wonder of the invisible being. The theme song for The Rough-Faced Girl is performed with guitars, recorder, and voice. The music interprets the courage and belief of the rough-faced girl's vision, which leads to her success.
Come out into the garden stories and songs. Sing a tale, tell a story, draw a picture of what's been told. Imagine along, imagine along. Sit down and listen right where you are. We're going to travel very far. Come along, take a journey off into a distant land. Imagine along, imagine along, imagine along.
For Out into the Garden, a series of stories, music, and poems, I'm Mary Ellen Monroe.
Come out into the garden of stories and songs. Sing a tale, tell a story, draw a picture of what's been told. Imagine along, imagine along, imagine along.
Out into the Garden is a production of Aura Publications Incorporated, Pittsford, New York, recorded at Dejalon Studios, Rochester, New York.